box has a brand new pack of cards. Let's see what's inside.
Hey guys, I bet you didn't expect to see this random dude here. This is my friend Dan, Baratheon specialist.
That's right.
He really knows his stuff here. So today we're going to be going over the Blackwater. Any comments, Dan? That was a pretty good comment, Dan. We're going to start off with small folk mob here. So right away you notice it's an ally.
It's an ally, and it's got the boring icons.
Everyone hates those icons, but the Starks love them.
I haven't seen many shadow cards for Starks. I notice they typically appear in Maester decks. I've seen quite a few in Tyrell decks, quite a few neutrals.
The only Stark cards I've seen that were Shadow were Boltons. I kind of thought that was the sub-faction of the Starks that did Shadow. This is not. This is just sacrifice unique Stark to put it into play from Shadow. That's great, though. It's basically just like a good body with good strength. You can Shadow
to do a sack card that might want to be
probably does. But I'd say in a vacuum, usually probably not worth sacrificing a unique character to put a 4-cost in for free. Uniques are usually around 4-cost or more.
I know that at least Bran and maybe Arya are cheaper ones.
Exactly.
That are definitely unique, and I almost know for sure that one of them has...
Rickon, 1 cost.
Rickon does, yeah. He's a quick 1
yeah,
cost.
So
or that can give you a 4-strength body on the field.
So Starks doubly love this condition, I feel like, because they have cheap uniques, and then they also have cards that like to be sacrificed. So in a vacuum, I would say this card is bad, but I would say it's decent for its faction. Like, we have another Stark card that's a Shadow card, and this one is an event. I mean, what do you think about this card? It supports Winter, which the Starks can do a lot.
Yeah, so that's where you're probably going to see the most out of the card, but what I do think is interesting is it has the ability to pull itself back to your hand. Although you couldn't play it again during that turn, it's basically something that your opponent now knows you have in your hand. It's going to be a potential target for intrigue challenges. Better to have it in your hand than not have it in your hand, I guess, if you were trying to avoid getting something else discarded.
Well, what if you're the second player, though? Like, your opponent has no more intrigue challenges, and then next turn you can just Shadow it first thing for 2. Maybe you can't afford to do that every turn, but the ability to do that every turn to get extra claim every turn, basically, is pretty crazy, especially because a lot of Winter cards already have pretty high claim.
Yeah, that's true. And the only thing is, like, you are playing it for 3 each turn. So that's just 3 gold. You're sinking into something that probably will happen, but still might not happen.
And only for one challenge, too. It's not raising your claim for the whole turn. It's just whatever you think is the most important challenge. Like, probably not going to be worth 3 gold every turn, but the fact that you have the option is cool, and the fact that you can hide it from intrigue by putting it in shadows for 2, even if you can't afford the whole 3, is pretty helpful, because it's really hard to remove things from shadow. I just think this is a cool card. I mean, like, I wouldn't put it in a shadow deck or anything, but I would definitely put it in a Winter deck. They have the most support for Winter plot cards, which already kind of support themselves with other plot cards. So that's pretty solid. And just being able to, whenever you want, say just like, fuck it, I want this to have more claim, like, on any challenge, that's pretty helpful. Like, Lannisters, for example, can get an extra claim on, like, intrigue. Or, like, everyone has something where they kind of commit to it and they build their deck around and they can claim that up. But this
evens it out. The only thing is that it's loyal.
That's frustrating.
But if you're running a Winter deck, that might be for you.
I would definitely put in at least 1 because it's cool. Now we have Tyrell's here. Take a copy of Highgarden Jester. So we have another Fool with Insight. We've been seeing a lot of these recently. And Highgarden Jester is better than Moon Boy in the sense that he doesn't force you to discard cards when he loses, but he also doesn't have to lose for it to happen. Anytime you trigger his Insight, you have to put a card back in your deck. So it doesn't discard it, and it's on top of your deck, so you know you're going to get it soon, but you also don't get any hand advantage from Insight. So
there's some strength in knowing that in your hand you might have some fetch ability based on your assortment. Like, let's say you had 3 characters in your hand and you knew you could search the top few cards of your deck with an ability.
Yeah, and Tyrells can. They can do that better than anyone. Like, mess with the top card of their deck. Sometimes they want to put a card on the top of their deck just so they know what it is, so they can flip something over and it's like, real top card of your deck. If it's a character, then pick a character and it gains strength equal to that card's strength.
And this would give you exactly
this would help. So it's basically like you're never going to see a character this cheap that has Insight, no strings attached. This just turns Insight into scrying. Instead of actually going +1 on a card, you just draw a card and then you get rid of your worst one. So your hand is the same size, but it's a little bit better, and you have a bit of information. Tyrells also have some Fool support. So overall, I would say this isn't a super complicated card. It's just a kind of way to play with Insight and put it on cheap.
Probably don't want to run more than 2 because it starts to weaken out after that point. You're not going to win anything but a power challenge in which he's participating, unless you're going for some other kind of victory.
It is a non-unique fool though, which is pretty rare. Most of the fools are unique, and so fool support can be pretty tricky if you're running multiple copies of unique characters. But actually, having multiple copies of this, if you are making a fool deck, which I don't know if it can fully be made, and it's not more than just an engine. Yeah, no, that card's fun. I'd like to make a fool deck actually. This one is very similar to the Stark event in that it's the same no printed cost, but then same total shadows cost. It just searches for anything with shadow, which is crazy because it's not just characters, it's like other events and stuff.
In the top 10 cards of your deck, which synergizes great with the Fool. If you know that you've just discarded with the Fool or put on top of your deck a card with shadows, fetch it with this.
Boom. I mean, searching the top 10 cards of your deck is huge searchability no matter what. But if you're already playing a deck like Tyrell, so you can manipulate the top cards of your deck, it's even more helpful. This is just crazy because it doesn't even have to be in faction. You can search anything that has the shadow keyword, which goes well with like a lot of agendas.
Right.
And it also has the benefit of supporting summer plot cards. But I think this one could be much more of a one-off searcher and just maybe if you have 1 or 2 summer plot cards and you're like, I'm going to search for 2 cards, that could be helpful, but you don't even need to be.
You also get to put it back in your hand. It's a pretty common kind of card. You could either be running them, kind of in contrast to what we saw in the Stark event that we just...
Because Starks definitely are like the biggest winter faction. I would say Tyrell is probably the biggest summer faction. Everyone has like 1 or 2 winter cards and 1 or 2 summer cards, but this definitely doesn't even need to go in a summer deck. Like there's the agenda Kings of Summer, but this is also, I think, way better in one of the shadow agended ones where it supports so many cards with shadow. It has so much searchability.
The Kingsguard deck, in fact.
Yeah,
If you have a deck of Kingsguard, a lot of them are in shadows. If you run Tyrell as your main faction.
And you can Knight of Flowers as a Kingsguard, and
Perfect.
he's a shadow card, and he's a Tyrell. So this card is pretty cool. I think it's a really good searcher for shadows decks. Okay, so Joran is great. He's such a good troll card for the Troll Knights Watch deck. He is a 6 cost, so right away you're going to obviously say, I need Great Hall for this guy. And unfortunately, for a 6 cost, he only has an ability that triggers when he enters play. But then you can just take characters from your opponent. Doesn't matter if they're loyal or not. Doesn't matter if they're unique or not. It's just about their printed cost. And you're only losing out on a little bit of gold advantage if you can get a 5-er.
I don't know if you mentioned this. It is loyal. So you are bending the knee to the watch.
Yeah, you are foiling your own Hollow Hill, but I think
Right.
that's fine because it actually stops you from feeling restricted because now you're free to pick loyals to steal without messing up your Hollow Hill already. And that's the thing is a lot of these cards that really support taking cards from your opponent are loyal ones, which isn't too bad because if you're taking cards from your opponent anyway, it would be kind of foolish to rely on Hollow Hill because you never know what you're going to get. I will say, though, that what's more annoying is that the Wandering Crow trait is something only he has, and he's not a Builder, Ranger, or Steward, so he doesn't support a lot of those things, and he's not as searchable, and he's really expensive.
And, yeah, not a good target for the Iron Bank will have its due.
I would disagree because then you can reuse his ability. I mean, once he's on the board, he's not that threatening of a body.
But once he leaves play, they get control of the character back.
But you can still mess around with it. If you use Journey to Old Town, which during the plot phase makes him leave play, but then he re-enters next plot phase, you can switch Yoren's target, which is pretty cool. That's a Night's Watch event that is interesting and has some combos, but you definitely have to build your deck around it. So having one more card like Joran that you could do sassy combos with to impress your friends is pretty cool. It's worth noting there's also another version of Joran that's way cheaper. There's a 3 cost, and he can also steal cards, but 3 costs or lower and from your opponent's discard. So that's less of a commitment than this one. And this one, I will say, has terrible stats, like 3 strength for a 6 gold is bad, and it's also just typically bad for it to be this expensive to have an effect that only activates when it comes in and then it just does nothing. So having no body and no effect is unfortunate, but hopefully the body you just got with him and comes with an effect that you picked that's good. I think it's a really good card, but it's not for every Night's Watch deck. And now we have Bound for the Wall, which is an amazing Night's Watch loyal event. So it's just after you win a challenge, it doesn't even need to be by 5 or more or anything. It's barely even a condition. You're probably going to win a challenge as attacking player unless you're playing a strictly defensive Night's Watch deck, which you could, but you wouldn't put this in. And then you just look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. You both look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck.
Perhaps even more tragic. Because
It's
at the very
so
end,
hard for them.
Oh, it's heartbreaking.
To watch you, what am I going to take? I'll take this one, and then it just shuffles them all in anyway. Cool.
You're pretty likely, too, to find a character in the top 5 if a deck is balanced. I feel like you want probably more characters than anything
No, absolutely. I think you're going to have, like, half of your deck plus or minus, like, 5 or 6 cards-ish. on average, probably be characters. This is definitely the best card type to work with. Night's Watch doesn't have a problem with running characters that they took from your opponent because they can use like the wall to turn them into Night's Watchmen, so they still get support. It doesn't matter if it's loyal or non-loyal, but like we showed with Joran, you're probably not going to be running Hollow Hill in this type of deck. The other cards go on the bottom of your opponent's deck. It's not even shuffled. So your opponent actually really does get some information from this. So they know what cards they won't draw.
Yeah, as long as they don't have duplicate copies. The other thing you have is information of cards they could fetch with search effects. If you know they have if you've just seen their plot deck, you know they have a search, you can say, oh, they're probably going to search this location next turn.
And you could see their plot deck with Crow as a Tricksy Bird.
That's right, which you might as well be running with
everybody's
a deck like
favorite card. So, yeah, this is just a really good card. I think it's actually one of the strongest cards for this Night's Watch Troll Stealing deck because it's only 2 costs. You can run 3 copies of it. You can use it several times per turn if you want and just stack your field with your opponent's cards. Like, it's in their deck. They had no way to put it somewhere else. You just steal it. It's awesome. Oh, now we're on to the Baratheon, so I'm going to go ahead and defer to Dan for Preston Greenfield.
This guy's pretty strong in a deck like one of my favorites where you use Starry Sept. Use the House of the Red Door to grab Starry Sept for the entirety of the game. Basically, Melisandre in the Baratheons is a character that likes to kill things by stealing power from them. Other cards like Consolidation of Power will move power from the opponent's faction card, or I think in some cases even from your faction card. This will do the same thing, put power from faction cards onto opponent's characters, making them targets for Melisandre.
I think this is a fairly important card because, well, first of all, it's a non-loyal Kingsguard and it's a non-loyal Shadow, so there are 2 agendas that can splash this into a deck that's not even running any Baratheon banner. So this guy's very versatile, and he's one of the few Kingsguard cards that you have to run if you're running a White Cloaks deck, so you'll probably be seeing him if you're messing around with that deck. He has a weird ability. Luckily, it's not one of those abilities that only activates when he comes out of Shadow, but it's not even really an ability that cares that much about Shadow. It's just winning a challenge, and you get the surprise factor, but is that worth the extra gold? Maybe, maybe not. He's also a knight. He gets a ton of knight support. I just think it's really unique that the Baratheons have a lot of ways to sort of disperse their own power on and off their characters and faction card, but there's not that many ways to get power on your opponent's cards, or certainly take it from their faction card and put it in their cards, which things like Melisandre definitely wants. Like this guy in Consolidation of Power that mess with your opponent's power and not just yours, I think are like super helpful.
Yeah, and as long as you have the military strength, you can also be claiming these cards with power once you get the power from their faction card. Then you're ahead like 2.
Yeah, this guy's solid. I think he's fun, and I think he's a good Kingsguard. He's better than most of the other ones, at least in terms of how much I like their design.
I'd like to play him in a deck where you want to always have more power on your faction card than your opponent, as a condition to satisfy different triggers.
That's true, because he's never going to change your opponent's power sum. He's not going to change how close or far your opponent is to winning, but he will change how much they have on their faction card, which a lot of
Baratheons.
A lot of Baratheons, and as we just saw, that Wildling card.
Yes, right.
2 Wildling cards, so use him in a Wildling deck. That's our challenge. What about this one?
This one I don't find particularly appealing, largely for its high cost and very specific ability. After a card you control comes out of Shadows, haven't seen many of them in the Baratheons that would synergize well.
Nor I. That's what I was going to say. Is like, I don't think this is bad Shadow support, but I don't think that the Baratheons can pull it off.
The only thing I see coming to mind is the Bobby B deck, where you use the Bobby B with Renown, that after he gains power for your faction card,
as well.
Working again with this knight character. If you're just rushing that win objective, just like get as much power as you can as quickly, basically outpace your opponent.
But also in a more complicated way of, I think the Baratheons don't just like outpacing your opponent, because that's the only win condition.
They want to cover like every angle.
They
want to get it from
They like
every
dispersing the power. They really like moving it around, even if they're not gaining power, their opponent's not losing power.
It's a total control thing.
Yeah, and then if your opponent's power, if you do that, is on certain things they have, it's more fragile. Whereas if you're Baratheons and you built your deck around this, and your power is on stuff you have, then they get like buffs. They get to stand, or they get strength or something. Yeah, I do think that this is really good, considering that just being able to pop power on your Baratheons is really helpful. A lot of the time it stands them. But you would have to basically make a Baratheon deck with the Shadow agenda to run this card to even have enough targets, because you'd have to pull in non-loyal Shadows from other factions. And then what other in-faction support is there? This would you'd be pulling
It's
in
a
things.
3 cost or 4 over 2 turns
Five.
with shadows.
5.
Oh, 5 over 2 turns.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, no, 4, you're right.
Just cut it.
I won't. This is a solid target for support of the people. And that's
in your hand.
no, it puts it in play.
Oh,
And that's
okay.
that's one thing I do like about shadow cards is that some of them cost more, but then their printed cost is low enough that they can be fetched by support of the people
So,
or
okay, in that
retrieved by
case-
flea bottom.
Because you're probably going to be winning power challenges anyway, and hopefully by 5 or more strength, you could easily fetch it with support of the people.
It's also worth noting that this will at least get one guaranteed use out of itself, because after it comes out of shadows, you can kneel it as a reaction and immediately activate that ability. So even though you're paying a lot out of pocket for it, you're getting a guaranteed power as soon as it comes in, and
Yeah,
all the
that's
buffs
not
that come
bad.
with that.
It could even be a game ender.
However, yeah, ultimately I think this card is good in supporting Baratheon themes that exist, and it's not bad as a card in general, and as a card concept it's well designed, but I don't think Baratheons just have enough Shadows cards.
And I don't
do
recommend
this.
using it as a target for House of the Red Door.
You heard it from the House of the Red Door expert. So there are obviously already 2 versions of Tyrion, but here we have the 3rd one, and Dan, I'm sure you immediately noticed the small council trade on this version of Tyrion.
I
Let's
actually did.
support that.
What I noticed is that it has a lot of support for shadows, and I think it's probably best in a deck where you're going to be trying to pull as many shadow cards out a turn as you can. Because once you flip one over, you could choose a very, very low cost card you control that isn't in shadows, put it in shadows, and reveal it with its printed cost, like a 1 cost. It's another card you control. It could be a 0 cost location. You could bring it out for free.
You could.
And that's just a free trigger.
You can use it with other Shadows cards if you're using the Shadow Agenda that lets you pull in other ones from other factions. But if you're using the Shadow Agenda that lets you put non-Shadow cards in Shadow, this guy just adds to it because you're probably going to be using cards that have effects like when they enter play and stuff like that, and Tyrion just lets you reuse cards that have effects that are like when this card enters play.
Yeah, very strong for
Kind
any
of like
card
Journey
that
to
has
Old
that.
Town. Yeah,
Yeah.
like Yoren, for instance. If
Yeah.
you were these are both loyal. That's impossible.
That's impossible.
But if you were running cards like that that have effects when they enter play, it's cool that you have cards that let you reuse them like Tyrion. And normally shadowing a card and taking it out is a big investment, but just making it its printed cost again, so you're basically replaying it, is pretty cool. Plus, again, like things are actually probably less vulnerable in shadows than they are in your hand because of intrigue challenges, so they're pretty safe.
He's a little costly. Over 2 turns, it seems like once you're at like 6 gold, reducing that to 5 gold in the next turn might actually be a good play. I have a harder time like
It's just great
justifying
haul.
lower cost adjustments, but this one not too bad. Yeah, you could great haul it.
I actually think it's a really solid cost because it's only 1 more expensive if you outshadow it, and its effect doesn't require you to use shadow, but obviously it triggers its own effect, same as
Right.
the last card. But
Nice
it's
shot.
also perfectly 6 cost, which just is the cheapest target possible for Great Hall to reduce to 4, which is really helpful. He's really good. I think honestly the biggest downside of this guy is that you can't run the other versions of Tyrion. And that will lock you out of a bunch of Lannister strategies. Like, you probably won't be using too many clansmen. And the other version of Tyrion, the 4-cost version, is really solid. So that is kind of a bummer. However, if you're making a Shadows deck, you're so outside the normal realm of strategy that I don't think you really can.
I think in a Lannister Shadows deck, he is a staple.
Bring him out with Heir to the Iron Throne. I run him in my Lannister Shadows
There
deck.
you go.
Don't put him in your small council deck, though, because it's... Don't make one. We have another event card that has no printed cost, but only shadow cost. However, its shadow cost is 0, so it's cheaper than the other ones we've seen. And it's similar to the other ones we've seen in that before we even talk about its effect, it has this sub-effect that if you control a plot card with X trait,
Yes.
bring this back to your hand. So right away, I think this pack is really good at illustrating what each faction likes in their plot cards.
Especially for the agenda.
The Reigns of Castamere.
The Reigns of Castamere, exactly right.
Exactly.
You're going to probably see a scheme plot card revealed, even if it wasn't the first card revealed that turn.
And there are other Lannister cards that like schemes a lot as well. This just kind of adds to that. Because Lannies love schemes.
Also probably a great way to play Tyrion for cheaper.
It's true. I mean, like we've talked about, like shadow cards are good and bad for econ because they usually cost more overall, but you can disperse it over multiple turns when you're determining each turn how much gold you need. So that is very helpful in this game when you have agency at the beginning of the turn of how much resources you're going to have access to. This is very helpful in that scenario where you were shadowing a bunch of things to disperse their gold cost, and now all of a sudden they probably cost almost nothing using this. but this costs you 2 itself and only reduces the cost by 3. So that's not that helpful. I mean, you're only getting 1 in econ after like splashing a lot of gold out. I don't think this card is that helpful. However, just being a Lannister Shadows card, considering that Lannisters and Dorne and Tyrell, I would say, are probably the top 3 factions with the most shadow support, it's good. If you're playing loyal Lannisters already, you can definitely incorporate this in. It's just not going to give you as much econ as it seems like it would. We have a Maester, a non-loyal Maester, so you can toss him into your Conclave deck, you can toss him into your Ironborn combo deck, you can toss him into your Ironborn regular deck. He's got a great trait, use him without wit, whatever, it's a phenomenal trait. He's cheap, his stats are trash, but he has a very simple effect. When another character would die, oh, no, actually he died. So that's pretty cool in Ironborn decks that like to have a little bit of control over A, killing things they have, and B, saving things they have, which seem like they would be opposites, and they are, but for some reason Ironborns try to do both, and this guy is good for both strategies. His facial hair is solid.
When I look at this card, the card that comes to my mind is Silent Sisters, which will just get a free buff from this guy saving another character. It's like a double plus in my book.
Silent Sisters works, I think, better with Ironborn than any other faction if you're not actually running them in the 7 deck,
right,
and you're just running them as a neutral character.
Trying to make it the 7 deck, I didn't even see that many 7 support for killing themselves.
There really isn't. There really is not much.
It seems like it's more of just like a card to definitely splash into another deck where you know that killing characters on your own is going to be
where you're just like, I have, if I get this late game, my opponent will have won this many military challenges. I think that would be kind of sloppy deck building, honestly.
Right.
Of like, okay, I'm going to hope that I draw this at a
card
point
in every deck,
yeah,
or not in any deck.
Exactly. I think that Silent
paired
Sisters
with a card like this,
these.
Paired with the Maester Kerwin, I think we have.
However,
strong...
I would disagree with you there because Silent Sisters, right, they get +1 strength for every character in your dead pile, but this doesn't actually add to that because he kills himself to save another character. So you're not actually killing him whenever you want.
I imagine it as a defensive maneuver, perhaps. I think it's just more of like a control.
He's not good against military challenges because you're going to pick something that you want killed instead of something that you want to save.
Right. The idea, I think, is that you would have some ways to defend against military challenges, and then this guy would just be a way to take care of targeted removal.
I would also toss in that I think this guy is honestly good with military challenges now that I think about it because, yes, if you wanted him dead, you would just pick him theoretically, right? But they actually have a lot of support for saving characters, and then you get to either stand them, or you get to draw a card, or they get strength or something.
The Ironborn do?
Yeah, the Ironborn do.
Okay.
Which is what I was saying is weird, because they like to kill them, but then they have an opposite strategy that likes to save them.
Also, it would go well in that deck.
It would be cool, because then
Sisters.
now all of a sudden, you have a free way of saving something after a military challenge. You can pick anything you want for a military challenge, and then kill it, and then this guy kills himself instead. So once this guy comes out, losing a military challenge instead of waiting for targeted removal or doing it yourself is a great way to just save something if that's a way to buff it. But he's not the best Maester I've seen.
The fact that he's unique, I think, kind of turns me away from it.
That's a good point.
It's like you're only probably going to get to do this once.
Yeah, you don't want a character that's unique to have an effect that kills it. That's just inherently bad. Because then if you run more copies of it, it's likely to be a dud later. But if you run fewer copies of it, any card that's encouraging you to run few copies of it is encouraging you to not rely on it because it's not consistent.
Right. It would just be something to build into your strategy. Saving characters.
I agree with that. It's fine. Maybe run 1 copy, and then you can search them out with that Maester plot card. But in the end, I would say there are other better Ironborn cards, also with better traits, who can do a similar thing. However, he's only 2 costs, so why not?
Bloody Cup.
This Bloody Cup, I mean, what a lovely picture we have. So it's a song. There's not that many song events, but there is plenty of support. So this is fun and does allow for some wacky combo potential. And obviously supports the Ironborn strategy of getting unopposed challenges, usually through stealth, sometimes through fishing net, if that's your game.
And I think as long as you're the first player, after you win the challenge, you can put a character on the opponent's deck, and then if you won using pillage, you can then pillage that character.
Very right, Dan. You are seeing the weird thing about this card is that its trigger condition is supported by the unopposed challenge stealth strategy of the Ironborn, but its actual effect supports pillage. Right. So this is weird because pillage is such a bad keyword in a vacuum, and I will go on the record saying this, it is terrible in a vacuum, that they had to design the whole Ironborn strategy around when something gets pillaged, do this. When this type of thing gets pillaged, do this. When your opponent has this many cards in their discard pile, do this. A bunch of weirdly specific effects that only work with pillage. That I think to use a successful pillage deck, you need to have almost every card either pillage or support pillage. And this card that sort of supports pillage, but also sort of supports the unopposed challenge strategy. Like if you're just using pillage and you don't have stealth in your deck, for example, you're never going to trigger this, even though it does have a good effect. But there is a lot of overlap between the two strategies, and even in a deck that is not trying to do it at all, it's not absurd to get an unopposed challenge, especially with something that's in your hand and is slightly telegraphed by having 2 gold out, but your opponent could assume it's a number of things. So
yeah, 2 gold is a pretty high cost to have to play during the challenge. I don't know how good the Ironborn are at increasing their gold value or decreasing the cost of their cards, so this might be a strong commit.
It's pretty clear in the design what they were going for. You know, oh, the Ironborn like to win with stealth. Oh, the Ironborn like to discard cards from your opponent's deck. And even if you can't discard it with pillage, it's not bad because it's a type of removal. It's targeted removal. Killing them, you know, can sometimes get them back more easily. If you can put it on top of their deck and then either pillage it or shuffle their deck, that's problematic for them. So, yeah, I see what they were going for with this. It's a little mixed in its idea of what you're going for with deck building, though. But there's a lot of overlap for sure, so it could definitely work. Yeah, so this guy is 6 cost total with Shadow, or 4 printed. Well, 4 or lower printed for Targaryens right away. You're going to notice that Aegon Targ can bring it out of Shadows, and so can Jon Con. Maybe I'm mixing those up. One of them can. And you can just toss a Targ card to the discard pile if it has the right printed cost to bring him out of Shadows. That's obviously helpful because some Targ cards like to be discarded. Some Targ cards like to have you have few cards in your hand. There's a lot of support for that, so this cost is definitely least offensive in a Targ deck compared to others. But what do you think about the icons?
They're the interesting icons for sure. It's nice to have military in the deck just to support the general, killing your opponent's characters, overwhelming them with strength. 4 strength for 4 cost, not too bad. Mm-hmm. And if you're getting it for free, even better. And then Intrigue is just good to defend against unwanted Intrigue challenges. You're probably going to want to get rid of the cards in your hand on your own terms.
It's true.
But
because especially, you know, if you're milling your own hand, you have no room for error. You're getting rid of the bad cards, and you're leaving only the good cards left. And your opponent's probably not going to have any bad targets for Intrigue.
Or maybe you get rid of the card in your hand with this, and then there's no threat of Intrigue, so you don't have to block for Intrigue.
If you only have 1 card left, absolutely.
Right.
If you're using this cost a lot, and you have 1 card left, at that point you're like, fuck it. I don't care if you get an Intrigue challenge. Go for it. I don't have anything in my hand. And the fact that this guy is Shadow and you can trigger that last minute, like right when they declare the Intrigue, is pretty cool. Ultimately, I would say you're right. Like, I don't think card advantage is that important in this game compared to others, because of Intrigue mostly, and the fact that you draw 2 cards. But if you're using the target strategy that discards cards from your hand, you're playing with fire. You are going to keep the cards that you need, and obviously not discard it if you need it. But the second your opponent lands an Intrigue challenge, they are more than likely to strike near the heart. You're probably not going to have any filler cards in your hand, because in other decks, sometimes you just can't afford to play all the shitty cards in your hand. But in Targs, if you're discarding them, I don't know. It's also worth noting, though, that this is, since it's a non-loyal card with Shadows, this can be run in any faction with the Shadow agenda.
It does require a Targaryen card to be discarded, though.
Oh, I didn't notice that. And with printing cost 4 or lower.
So
okay, so this...
cut that all out.
Maybe. So if you are trying to use this in a Shadows deck that uses non-loyal Shadow cards, it's still better run some Targaryens. However, there are plenty of non-loyal Targaryen Shadows cards that fit that theme, like Aegon and Jon Con's. Covert Loyalist, I think... That's just kind of amusing to me, that term. Like, this guy is somewhere in Westeros hiding. And look at him painting this secret flag. Well, this card is simple. Pay 1. During the challenges phase, annoying, but otherwise it would probably cost 3. And then search your deck for a dragon character, reveal it, add it to your hand. There's also a lot of support for events and dragon characters if you use the one version of Daenerys. That's like when you play an event, search top 10 cards of your deck, blah, blah, blah. So this is helpful for searching your entire deck for these dragons, which are ridiculous. Each of them has 2 or 3 versions that are different costs, have different effects, work for different situations. And because of the challenges action, if your opponent was going to discard it with Intrigue, you can just wait until after their Intrigue challenge to do it.
Yeah, I agree. It's like probably best used there. I'm disappointed that it's not a song event.
Yeah, you would think it would be Music of Dragons, but I guess the Music of Song implies maybe lyrics. And Dragons, the Song of Dragons is I mean, it's a good searcher, and it's an event. Yeah, no wonder it's loyal. Only Targaryens have dragons. There are only 3 of them, even
You wouldn't really need to run.
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter. But being able to search your deck for any of them is fine. You're probably going to search, in my opinion, for the low-cost ones. Play them, and then play something like Fire Made Flesh to scrap them and age them up into the high-cost ones. But hey, I don't know what kind of deck you're running. Dagos Manwoody. Now, I really want to like this guy because he's one of the tragic few Dornish lords, so he obviously gets support from Doran Martell, who will give him +1 strength for every plot card in your use pile, and this guy even further supports that idea of having a bunch of plot cards in your use pile. If there are 5 or more different traits, which does not take 5 turns, I just want to point out, sub-plot cards have 2 or even 3 traits. Prince Doran's Behest, the one that you play it and then you just put another one, like another plot card out, that itself has 2 traits. So literally just instantly with that card, you get +1 plot card in your use pile, +2 traits in your use pile. That'll get you closer. But is that worth it to just get Renown and Stealth on this guy?
On a 5 cost?
On a 5 cost.
Boring icon.
Especially because half the reason that I was even thinking of running him is not because of the House Manwoody trait. I'll tell you that much. That has no support. I don't even think that has another card.
Lord support.
It's Lord support, and especially Martell Lord support from Doran, of them being buffed for each block card in your use pile. But then if it's getting buffed to an absurd amount of strength, you probably don't need Stealth.
He's non-loyal. You might have a lot of Lord support between 2 factions. Maybe you want to run a plot deck that will allow you to have more variety and better synergy within it.
I mean, he's got good stats. So if you can bring him out and you don't have enough plot cards in your use pile, no matter what deck you're running, that's probably going to happen eventually, unless you are sticking to one of those plot theme agendas.
Yeah, he's got a nice looking flag too.
He does have a sick flag. It's just the Martell flag, so I don't know. I would take away his House Manwoody trait. You don't even see his face. Why is he even unique? And now we have the Mountain Skull. It's a fun little 3-cost attachment. It's one of those attachments that has the ability to fetch itself back from your discard pile, but it also only works under very specific circumstances. So all it actually does is give the attached character +2 strength and renown. Is that worth it? For 3 gold, maybe sometimes, but when you're building your deck, probably not. But however, if your opponent's character with strength 6 or higher is killed, then you all of a sudden add this back to your hand. That's cool because it means it's like solid intrigue fodder, and you can afford to discard it for the cost of other cards if you're running like a mixed target deck or something. But you still have to play it for 3 gold. You still have to pay the cost.
This would be a good card for targeted removal. I don't know what targeted removal exists within the Dorn. I'm really not the Dorn expert.
I'll take over. That's my name. Yeah, I'll tell you, it doesn't matter what targeted removal exists in Dorn because this isn't all about you. This is about your opponent. If your opponent never puts a card with printed strength 6 or higher into play, doesn't matter what you can't target something that's not there.
Unless you want to use a plot card to switch control and give them one of your 6 costs.
If you want to do something wacky with Broken Vows,
Tycho
go for
Brahe. Give it to him. See if they can get rid of him.
Give him Tycho. I don't think it's worth it to just play from your hand for 3 cost and give them +2 strength and renown. It might be worth it sometimes, but like I said, not overall. But if you have a suspicion that the guy that you always play with, that you always hang out with, is going to have a 6 or higher cost out, and you can kill it because maybe you have some targeted removal or something, then this might be worth it as just intrigue fodder that you can then put into play. However, if you don't have targeted removal, your opponent is never going to pick their 6 cost for military claim. They're never going to do that. So you have to have targeted removal for this to work, and it's just not worth it enough to work on its own. I think this is the worst Dorn attachment I've ever seen. One of the worst cards I've ever seen in any card game. Maybe not. Why is it even unique? I know why it's unique. This card is bad. This card is, can we agree? Bad. This is a bad card. Okay, so I never introduced Dan as the 7 expert, but he knows Sparrows well, let me tell you.
Well, I know Sparrows because it fits very nicely into my Baratheon deck.
Dan likes to get Starry Sept out, and honestly, I think that's the best target for this
card.
Right.
When this card comes out of Shadows, you can move power from your opponent's faction card, so already they're going down 1 on the win condition, but you can move it to the Starry Sept, which you can then use to put power on another character, preferably one that your opponent has that's giving you trouble with its activated abilities. But then you can also use it as a target for Melisandre.
This is really helpful in that, like, yeah, it's 4 costs to bring it out, and it has pretty weak stats, and it's annoying to me from a design standpoint that it has a printed cost that you will never play because its stats are not worth it, and it only has an ability that works when it itself comes out of shadow, so it has no passive. It's just a dead body on the board if you don't shadow it. But you can put a power from your opponent's card, so you're stealing a power from them, on any of the 7 character you control. And let me just say, you will never not have a target for this because this is the 7. If at the very least you're stealing a power from your opponent.
In House of the Red Door, you get your location that you choose can't be destroyed. So it's a safe target for this if it comes out of shadows.
Yeah, there are a few of the 7 cards. Most notably and best would be the Starry Sept.
Isn't it also the Grand Sept of Baelor?
Great Sept of Baelor also uses power.
Right.
And so there are a few
so you
cards.
Go to Great Sept, and I think that does something else.
There's definitely a few cards with the 7 trait that benefit directly from having power beyond just contributing to your win condition. Just to put it into play and then take a power from your opponent and put it on itself.
That's pretty strong anyway.
That's like winning a power challenge, whatever you want, basically, for in that turn. I mean, it's obviously putting the power on more fragile
It's
bodies,
non-unique. You could do it 3 times.
If you have that kind of gold, your opponent would be like, what? You'd get him. White Cloak. I've talked about this card many times before. It's quite simple. It's a knight character you control only. However, it doesn't have to start a knight. It can be turned into a knight by the aptly named card Knighted. And then it just makes it a Kingsguard. So that can be helpful, most notably if you're using the White Book agenda, which, spoiler alert, coming up. That supports the Kingsguard trait. Not a lot of other things do. Almost nothing else does. But luckily, it recognizes that, and it also gives them another ability. You can kneel the attached character to save a king or a queen character. There are not many queens, but there are many kings, and there is good support for them. King in the North is one of the best plot cards in the game.
I think one of the best targets for this kind of card are cards that like to be knelt or have reactions to them being knelt. I would like to see this on Hot Pie, made a knight by Knight.
If you knight Hot Pie and you don't make him into a Kingsguard, he's going to be really sad. I would also like to take this opportunity to point out that I'm not closer to the camera than Dan. He's very small. Oh my gosh, it's the White Book agenda. So basically, this lets you include Kingsguard from any faction in your deck, mostly Lannister, but you have to include at least 7. Well, there's not that many. There's like 9 or 10, and they have to be different. It's more picking which 2 or 3 you're going to scrap. And then it also has this extra ability of, okay, after you win a challenge as the defending player, you can kneel your faction card to stand all the participating Kingsguard. Or if you have a king or queen,
opens up a whole lot of options.
You can
if you want
use
to get someone like
Selyse.
Marjorie Tyrell as your
Daenerys.
main queen, you could be pulling these Kingsguards that are lords.
Boom, boom, boom. The most notable thing about this is this is a deck building agenda, right? Like, this is one of those ones that's like, oh, this lets you bring in a huge plethora of other options, but it's not really a huge one. It's a very small card pool compared to all the other deck building agendas that let you use the 7 Maesters or shadow cards for sure. There's plenty more of those. This one gives you the fewest options, and then it also has a somewhat restrictive secondary effect in the sense that it requires you to kneel your faction card. So if you pick this card and you're like, I could have picked any other fucking agenda, but I picked this, and now I'm using all these shitty random Kingsguard, you're going to want to use this effect every turn on them. And that means you can't include a lot of things that rely on kneeling your faction card. Probably nothing. Certainly not the locations that stay out and do it every turn or every other turn or something. Maybe like a one-off event, but probably not even that. So that's a little bit frustrating, and I wish they would have fleshed out the synergy with the Kingsguard cards a bit more. After having made a Kingsguard deck, I'm not saying the Kingsguard cards are bad, but I'm saying unlike the Maesters, unlike the 7 cards, there's not enough of them to give you a large card pool of options, and there's not a defined enough synergy about them to make the 10 options you have good. They're all expensive.
I mean, you have to include a king or queen character, so at that point you have another high cost potentially. Is there a King Joffrey that's a cheap version of him?
I think there is like a 3-cost version of Joffrey.
If you can find a cheap king or queen, or a few of them even, great way to build your deck around this.
And Lannisters are decent for this because most Kingsguards are Lannisters, so you can still use Lannister support.
Now you can do things like King at the Wall.
King at the Wall,
King at the Wall. You can do things
you don't
like,
need to run a king if you run cheap attachments that make things kings.
Boy King.
King Beyond the Wall.
King
I just played in that game. The Boy King, yes.
King.
If you don't want to run Joffrey, you can run some kind of Joffrey surrogate. I like to use Hisdar. I have a Targaryen Kingsguard deck because Hisdar is a 6-cost, right? So he's high cost, but his effect is you can discard a card to reduce the cost of the next card you marshal, ambush, or bring out of shadows by 3.
Strong.
So that actually makes these a lot better, especially considering that the only Kingsguard supporting plot card brings them back from your discard pile. So if you use Hisdar toss a card to make the King's Guard cheaper. Next turn, you can put that right into play, even if it's an 8 cost. The only problem with that is that most of the King's Guard that really require the most resources require it because they're Shadows cards that only have an effect when they comes out of Shadows. Can bring out of your discard pile, but most of the time, you're probably just going to want to outshadow them. And now we have a fun little silly city plot card. Yeah, there's only one plot card today because there was an agenda. So this has shitty stats. 3 gold is below average and borderline useless. 1 initiative is just enough to beat some searchers, and of course 1 claim and 6 reserve. And then it has a forced interrupt, so this is not a choice. When the challenges phase ends, if there are 3 or more city plot cards in use pile, discard each character from play. So it's forced. You can't decide that you don't want to do it anymore after the challenges phase ends. You have to really commit to a board wipe that won't happen for a second. Yeah, like, it's not going to happen until later on in the turn. So it's not as useful if your opponent's just outwardly just completely fucking you.
Now, if you have a lot of cards in Shadows, they're not technically considered to be characters. So you can do this to scrap all of your opponent's cards that are not in Shadows, and then either bring your cards out of Shadows with whatever remaining gold you have after this initiates, or next turn.
This is it's a terrible board wipe in my opinion. The only thing that it has over
it's a pretty hard
board
condition
wipes,
to meet because then you're catering your deck to city plot cards.
But not even that. It's a deck building condition, but it's just saying this is not going to be usable until the 4th turn minimum. And that's really bad. If your opponent's beating you and you're saying my board wipe is not available for 2 turns, why the hell didn't you pick Valor Morghulis? This is shitty. The only advantage it has is that it's a city plot card. So then when you do use it, all of a sudden all the other cards that have benefits from city plot cards enjoy that. But really, I would say this is probably objectively worse than every plot or every board wipe plot card from a deck building and just a actual vacuumist perspective of like its effect is worse in the sense that you have to have 3 or more city plot cards, but also just the fact that you have to have played them means that you can only use this mid-game at least.
I would have liked to seen something maybe a little more downside, like a little more of a downside with a higher stats.
I think the stats are really where this goes wrong.
Like if you had 1 or more city plot cards, now all of a sudden you're running with something that you could only play really the first turn. If you weren't running city things, city cards like to have city cards in their used pile, so it would be a good first turn.
Not all.
Maybe easy enough
not
to
at the gates.
It just seems so specific.
What I've noticed about city cards is that I think their win condition, if you commit to the plot deck, is there's that one, I forget what it's called, but I think it is Littlefinger's face, and it's just like increase this card's gold, initiative, and reserve by 1 for every city plot card in your used pile. So if you're not using Words to Come, that's a maximum of 6. You're not going to waste any spot in your plot deck on a non-city card.
If you have a lot of gold modifiers on your cards in play and you don't care about initiative, maybe use it, for fill in your city used pile. I don't think it's even worth it.
I think this card sucks, frankly. I think if it were an interrupt, it would be viable. It would have its place. The fact that it's a forced interrupt just means, okay, this is a board wipe like
hard commit from the plot phase.
You're committing way too early, and your opponent is going to have plenty of time to prepare for that. It's affecting you as well, so it's not like you're gaining anything from the hard commit. It doesn't really have better stats than any of the other board wipes. It has better than Valor Morghulis, but it is worse than Valor Dohaira, so it's like completely average in that respect. And it also requires this absurd stipulation that requires you to be in the middle of the entire game and have a plot deck that's strictly city. I think this card is terrible, and I don't recommend it. Thanks for tuning into our special guest episode. I'll put a link to his channel where he reviews Baratheon cards in the description below. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks.